Welcome to this Education and Philosophy podcast, part of a series introducing key ideas in education and philosophy. The ideas covered in this series are discussed in relation to their potential use to present-day thought and practice. This series draws from the book Education and Philosophy, published by Sage, to which there is a link below. The term liberal, when placed in conjunction with education, implies some kind of association between education and freedom. In its 19th century sense, the word liberal also implied that to become educated, one would need to be free from necessity. Only those free of material distractions would be at liberty to become educated. And so, a liberal education depends upon a number of material givens, where economic constraints in particular must be loosened. In effect, a liberal education is intended only for those who can afford it, or those who are connected with wealthy individuals or organisations who can afford it on their behalf. Liberal understandings are developed only by those able to avoid the constraints of necessity and the distractions of a working life. This includes the constraints imposed by domestic labour, and hence a liberal education traditionally excluded women in a patriarchal society. In addition to economic freedom, a liberal education also requires freedom from threatening pressures that may arise within the self. Not everyone is capable of this kind of self-restraint, or so it is assumed. As the 19th century English poet and philosopher Samuel Coleridge put it, the gentleman is distinguished by the fact that he, quote, knows himself and walks in the light of his own consciousness. In other words, a liberal education demands a certain kind of self-mastery. This requirement provides the incidental satisfaction for those claiming to have achieved a liberal understanding of being able to place themselves at the end of a long and noble lineage, going back to attempts at self-mastery attributed to ancient Greek philosophers. As Ben Knights argues in his book The Idea of the Clerisy in the 19th Century, self-mastery is not considered to be an exclusively individual concern. In the 19th century it was, indeed, he claims, viewed as a prerequisite for positions of influence. As Coleridge put it, quote, he alone is entitled to share in the government of all who has learned to govern himself. Even though the idea of liberal education as a kind of self-mastery could boast an ancient pedigree, and this was part of its attraction, in its modern form it was devised to meet the problems posed by an increasingly secular order. Indeed, the liberal education that became popular in the 19th century would secularize older Christian ideas of purity. It drew a sharp distinction between a transcendent realm of order and the chaotic, impure, and sensual disorder that was thought to reign below, in the decidedly impure realm of lived experience. In this scheme of thought, the latter and lower phenomena were denigrated. These material distractions were to be overcome by the man of good character, by the man who had received a liberal education. He would be guided by a liberal elite. This elite adapted high humanist ideals to the needs of the 19th century, and thereby inherited a taste for Roman and Greek literature, as is explored in the related podcast on Renaissance and liberal humanism. Educated in such a way, such a man knew what was worth knowing about high culture, and was supposed to exude its refined qualities as a result. This representative of the liberal elite would invest culture with many of the attributes once associated with religion, where its greatest cultural achievements aspired to a kind of transcendence. The highest achievements of literature, music, and art were approached as almost divine in nature, reaching a universal significance for humankind. Marginalised and oppressed groups such as the labouring classes, the colonised, and women have typically been associated with a sensuous, worldly realm and hence have been implicitly or explicitly denigrated along with it. In this context, it is seen to be the duty of the liberal male elite to see through the disorder that surrounds them and those on whose behalf they presume to speak. Indeed, it is assumed that some ideas, particularly moral truths, need to be protected from an often hostile and debased reality. In this secular order, in a world in which priests no longer occupy the guiding position and thus hold the moral authority they once did, the educated man is elevated to become a member of an elite group, or clerisy, as Coleridge coined the term in the 19th century. This learned class would be responsible for preserving and disseminating a common cultural heritage. It would be revered for its ability to see through the untrustworthy seductions of immediate worldly phenomena. It would provide stability in times of change, offering intellectual and spiritual leadership to those masses who, cast adrift in a modern society, were judged to be in need of their guidance. Overall, as Knights argues, this elite perspective emphasizes a normative order and a hierarchy of values which is seen as beyond historical alteration, and which it becomes the job of the educated to protect. According to its advocates, the importance of this decidedly intellectual and spiritual project of the literary and philosophical elite could not be overstated. This is because the affairs of the mind are here related directly to the social health, the morality indeed, of the nation. In preserving and reproducing themselves, a literary elite would be caring for the social health of the country and perhaps empire they claim to serve. They would not necessarily be its rulers, as would Plato's philosopher king, but they would have the ear of those who are in charge. Despite its obvious elitism, the idea of a liberal education has certain attractions. It seeks to offset the dangers posed by the fragmentation of culture and society that necessarily occurs when a dominant structure of value, in this case the Christian moral order, comes into doubt. It draws attention to the dangers of academic specialization and intellectual fragmentation, a casualty of which has been a separation of moral questions from highly specialized academic inquiries. A liberal education does not abandon this moral dimension and is able to make connections across what have become distinctly disconnected fields of inquiry. It nevertheless perpetuates an assumption that moral judgments can only be made by those who have been appropriately educated. It develops an ideology of the intelligentsia that allows intellectuals to stand apart from society, positioning themselves above its preoccupations, believing that this kind of separation, this kind of privilege, is essential for intellectual activities that serve the well-being of society. This outlook allows the intellectual to maintain a benevolent vision of him or herself as a social benefactor who can only contribute to the common good by abstracting him or herself from involvement in worldly affairs. It is a notably self-serving, some might say delusional outlook. Of greater concern, perhaps, is that this kindly, rather self-gratifying vision betrays a palpable fear of losing control, of succumbing to the chaotic and sensual forces it associates with worldly affairs. This fear becomes expressed as a commitment to order that easily turns into a legitimation of the existing order on the grounds that at least it is an order. Admittedly, as educational commitments go, these ideas seem more appropriate to the 19th century context, where we might presume they were largely confined. They represent, to quote Knights, a constellation of notions about the way in which the universe is ordered and the conditions under which it becomes intelligible, that seems to be found today only amongst the most conservative representatives of an ailing aristocratic class. However, these ideals were also those of a bourgeois or middle-class intelligentsia and are still in circulation today. They are not confined to reactionary conservatives. Well-meaning defenders of education for its own sake continue to serve and uphold the commitments of a liberal education, shorn of its more obvious elitism, perhaps, but heavily laden with its social conservatism. These ideas are discussed in more detail in Chapter 11 of Education and Philosophy. If you would like to hear another podcast discussing a key idea related to education and philosophy, click below. Thank you for listening.